No, Cookie, we're not taking the week off just because your president is on trial. Oh, hey everybody, welcome back to J-L's Book Club, where we don't talk about Fight Club because I didn't read Fight Club. It's Memorial Day, and I thought, what better way to honor the fallen troops of the Civil War by doing Huck Finn and James, the new faux sequel to Huck Finn. But before we get to that, our beverage of the month, everybody. This month, it's an oldie but goodie, club soda. If you get a stain on your clothes, just drink some club soda and it goes away. I think that's how it works. Now, as said, 2 books this month. One was a real chore and an oldie but goodie, and the other is a new bestseller. And this is sort of a 2-parter. We'll discuss the first book first, but Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And then I reread that. I read it, I think, freshman or sophomore year of high school. I reread it to get to James by Percival Everett, which is currently a bestseller. And Percival Everett, if the name sounds familiar, he's written many books, but I was unfamiliar with him until American Fiction came out last year, which was based on his novel Erasure. So I said, I heard him on the New Yorker podcast because I'm fancy like that. And I said, that sounds like an interesting book. So I said, let me revisit Huckleberry Finn first. And I thought, how hard can it be? I read it in high school. It's like 300 pages. It's small. The Barnes & Noble Classic Edition is small. I bought a new copy to support the Twain estate because I don't know, they might be struggling right now. Not everybody had the 2020 I did in terms of windfall and success. But I've been told the Twain estate is doing fine. But I didn't want to reread and reuse my high school copy, which I'm sure was filled with copious notes and probably little animations of fake boobs. So I reread this book, and I don't know what all the hullabaloo is about, to be honest. I think I probably read it, I don't remember, freshman, sophomore year, 8th grade, whenever it was. It was probably really exciting because you heard a lot about it, and it had the N-word a lot. Let's just call him Neighbor Jim for the purposes of this discussion. In the Montel Jordan, for all my neighbors who have much flavor, this is how we do it. We're going to call him Neighbor Jim. This was a tough read because it's written, Twain wrote it, for those of you who aren't familiar or whose school districts banned it. It's written from the perspective of a over-exaggerating 12-year-old who's kind of not racist for the time, but racist for our times. Hence, Neighbor Jim is how he refers to Jim, the runaway slave. Now, I was able to follow, it was just, I think, reading this in school where you're like, we want you to read pages 1 through 20, and then we're going to spend a class discussing it. On the scale of school reading, it's interesting, it's fun, and you get walked through everything. But on my own, reading it like you would a novel, I had to really slow down because you know this is literature, or as I like to say, literature. So you have to, I don't want to speed through it like it's a John Grisham book. I want to be like, there's deep symbolism and things about history, and we can interpret different things. But it's just really hard to get through, to be honest. No offense, Twain. I get it, it's a classic, but it was just at times I'm like, what's going on here? And am I missing something? And it's fine, I think. I know that may not be what the Twain estate wants to hear, but it's obviously an important novel. It's an important novel from a Southerner reflecting on the racism and culture of the South. It's also sort of an anti-religious book, which I'm sure for some of you heathens that watch these book reviews, it's balm for your soulless soul. But the only passage I cut out from this is just a note from it says Introduction and Notes by Robert O'Mealy, who is, some sort of professor of fancy literature at some college, and he was hired by Barnes & Noble to do it. He's a Zora Neale Hurston professor of English at Columbia University. Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, sounds like a woke position at Columbia. You know where he was during the protests. So, just one note which bothered me, because everything bothers me. Because the real purpose of this is just to let you know I reread Huck Finn, but to get to James. There's several asterisks in the book where he's helping the reader. presumably maybe a young reader or young at heart. And where is the asterisk linked to? Give me 1 second. Oh, she had the grit to pray for Judas if she took the notion. There weren't no back down to her, I judge. I gave you the accent for free. And then the asterisk says, explaining what that sentence meant, she had the kindness and independence of mind to pray for Judas Iscariot, the notorious betrayer of Jesus Christ. Now, I know we're an increasingly secular society, but you need an explanation of who Judas is? You need a footnote just letting you know who Judas is? No, I don't accept that. I don't accept that. You don't have to believe in Jesus. I'll pray for you. You don't have to believe in Jesus, but you should know who Judas Iscariot is. You live on this planet. You live in the world. This is a major cultural figure worldwide. A major, I'm just saying. I don't think it needs to be explained. But, that's probably just my anger at comedy audience seeping through to my book review. But, I read it, and it ends happily, and I followed all the significant plot points because as I was reading James, I was like, okay, so I did follow the Huck Finn correctly. But between the slang and the really broken English of Jim, neighbor Jim, it was a tougher read than I anticipated. You really had to slow down, and even then I was like, am I following this right? And is it scatterbrained a little bit because he's trying to capture the spirit of an exaggerating Southern 12-year-old in the 1850s and 60s? Maybe. Maybe that's why it was. Maybe I read it perfectly. But Huck Finn, I don't recommend it. But I do recommend the next book. And maybe just because you have to... It's sort of like Mad Max. That's right. Nobody's going to give you the Mad Max Huck Finn comparison except on these book reviews. The first Mad Max with Mel Gibson, personal hero of mine, don't know anything he did after 2002. The first Mad Max is an atrocious movie. It sucks. The Road Warrior, the sequel that came out 3 years later, which is really sort of the classic Mad Max film, is awesome. And kind of the low-tech version of Mad Max Fury Road in many ways. I feel like Huck Finn, if you're going to read James, you should revisit Huck Finn. Because James just is James, no longer known as neighbor Jim, but James, is basically a book written from the perspective of James. And it's a very clever idea. And this is not, Percival Everett is somebody, he thanks Mark Twain in the acknowledgments. This is not somebody who's doing it from the perspective of Huck Finn got so many things wrong, it's so problematic, boo. No, this is an admirer of what Huck Finn meant and what Mark Twain was to literature and, sort of progressive values, especially for his time. So it's not one of these, I'm correcting the record, but it is sort of saying, let's do it from a different perspective. Let's say Jim is not the totally submissive, ignorant slave. Let's say he's actually a sharp person with agency who just understands the world he's in. So I laughed several times, but the book ends. It's a book where 2/3 of it is funny, and then 1/3 of it is sort of confronting the reality and giving you. I don't want to give away how it ends, but it's sort of almost Django Unchained. It's like if Huck Finn were redone by Django Unchained, but with more humor. It's kind of that vibe. So it's very satisfying, but there's a lot of there's some major twists, and those I will not give away. When I say major, I mean enormous at the end of the book. But the first 2/3 are pretty funny when he's not terrified. But this was the first part where I really kind of laughed out loud. And it's early in the book, but this will give you a vibe for sort of a lot of the book. That evening I sat down with Lizzie and 6 other children in our cabin and gave a language lesson. These were indispensable. Safe movement through the world depended on mastery of language fluency. The young ones sat on the packed dirt floor and I was on one of our 2 homemade stools. The hole in the roof pulled the smoke from the fire that burned in the middle of the shack. Papa, why do we have to learn this? White folks expect us to sound a certain way, and it can only help if we don't disappoint them, I said. The only ones who suffer when they are made to feel inferior is us. Perhaps I should say, when they don't feel superior. So let's pause to review some of the basics. Don't make eye contact, a boy said. Right, Virgil. Never speak first, a girl said. That's correct, February, I said. Lizzie looked at the other children and then back to me. Never address any subject directly when talking to another slave, she said. What do we call that, I asked. Together they said, signifying. Excellent. They were happy with themselves, and I let that feeling linger. Let's try some situational translations, something extreme first. You're walking down the street and you see that Mrs. Holliday's kitchen is on fire. She's standing in her yard, her back to her house, unaware. How do you tell her? Fire, fire, January said. Direct. And that's almost correct, I said. The youngest of them, lean and tall 5-year-old Rachel, said, Lawdy, miss'em, looky there. Perfect, I said. Why is that correct? Lizzie raised her hand. Because we must let the whites be the one who named the trouble. And why is that, I asked. February said, because they need to know everything before us. Because they need to name everything. Good, good. You are all really sharp today. Okay, let's imagine now that it's a grease fire. She left bacon unattended on the stove. Mrs. Holiday is about to throw water on it. What do you say, Rachel? Rachel paused. Miss'ems, the water gon' make it worse. Of course, that's true. And what's the problem with that? Virgil said, You're telling her she's doing the wrong thing. I nodded. So what should you say? Lizzie looked at the ceiling and spoke while thinking it through. Would you like for me to get some sand? Correct approach, but you didn't translate it. She nodded. Oh Lord, miss'ems, ma'ams, you want for me to get some sand? Good. I like because it's this idea that survival, is obviously paramount. And it's very dark humor if you think about the subject, but it's also funny in hindsight to be like, yes, they are sort of playing a trick. Just like when you'll hear things like whether it's singing spirituals, it was like sometimes you had enslaved people who could take advantage of the low expectations and ignorance on the part of white people of them to get away with certain things and to kind of be subversive. Sort of like with opioids, where doctors weren't prescribing it to black people as much because their bias was like, well, they can take the pain. And oddly enough, that racism allowed for many black people to escape the opioid crisis. So it's like a silver lining to the Klan hood of medical racism. But I really, really enjoyed James. It helps that it's written, 90% of the book is written as you would want to read something, as opposed to Huck Finn, which is 100% this broken, southern, phonetic sort of writing. Only when you see him doing a translation or like, oh, I was speaking to somebody, so I had to speak this way. So it's a very easy read. It's funny, and it's also, there's some very powerful moments in the book, and like I said, a humongous twist for anybody who is a fan of Huckleberry Finn. So definitely recommend it. And I think, as much as I just took a shit on Twain and Huck Finn, I think they're inseparable. I think you have to read one and then the other. So I would recommend rereading Huck Finn. It informs this and made this a more enjoyable read and more informed, where I'm like, oh, right. So that's how Jim is remembering that experience that Huck Finn talked about. And as you can imagine, they have very different experiences, and there are parts in Huck Finn where they go their separate ways. So Percival Everett fills in the gaps, but really enjoyed it. And like I said, Huck Finn is a little more homeworky, but I think you should read them both. So that's my recommendation. As for next month, everybody, 2 more books. We're cranking them out. The first one will be a critically acclaimed book about the Philippines' war on drugs by Rodrigo Duterte, called Some People Need Killing, which oddly enough was the working title of my comedy memoir, Now I Need a New One. So that's by Patricia Evangelista. And then to keep up the good vibes, another acclaimed book from late 2023 that I'm finally getting to, When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. Oh boy, sounds pretty woke. Looking forward to both of them. And just a small note, in case you're interested, a friend of mine, a fan of mine, who has a very popular true crime podcast. I appeared on the podcast before it was true crime. Oddly enough, I was one of the last guests on the show before they pivoted to true crime, and they became wildly successful. So if you need Exhibit 5,877,000 for the J-L Jinx, I was on his podcast twice. Like a month after I was on the second time, they pivoted to true crime, and they skyrocketed. They have like 1 million listeners a month. It's always fun to know I could help by no longer being part of the show. But he wrote a book about him and his mom is a Holocaust survivor, and it's called Surviving the Survivor, and you can get it, Barnes & Noble is where I bought mine because I'm a great person, but I know some of you animals use Amazon. The best I can say about it, it was a really funny read, and I don't want to say important, but, the woman has an incredible story, and it's written really with great humor by her son, who is, they both do the podcast together. But if you're looking for something, something funny, obviously James, but I would recommend this. This is not a paid advertisement or anything, but I did really enjoy this, and I feel like when a friend or a fan does something cool and I actually like it, might as well endorse it. So Surviving the Survivor, if you're in the mood for a good, quick summer read paperback to bring with you to the beach. So that's it, everybody. That's been this month's episode. I hope you liked it. A reminder to anybody who's watching this who hasn't downgraded their Patreon yet, get to that $3 level ASAP, because the $4 and $7 levels are disappearing. Because, once again, the integrity king. I don't want to keep milking my great fans for extra bucks. $3. If I ever start cranking out content that is super costly and worth more, I'll add like another tier above that. But downgrade if you haven't already. And that's it. So thanks for watching. And remember, books, they're like documentaries for smart people.